Last segment of today will be a panel titled Data, Ethics and Trust, Two Main Planes of Concern. And for this particular panel, we also have Mr. Sebastian Ziegler joining in virtually. So if the tech team can help set that up. Without further ado, I invite Mr. Ashish Agarwal from NASSCOM. He's the VP of Public Policy to take forward the discussion. Thank you, Ashish.
Right, great. We have Sebastian, so can we have Srinivas, Abha and Deepak also join us? Yeah. This is actually great. I thank the previous panel. They've given us 1 minute extra. But I think we will try to wrap it up as soon as possible. We'll not try to use all the time that we have. My work with NASSCOM is really on the regulatory and policy side. So I've been here for 6.5 years, and somehow Justice Shri Krishna Committee report had, that's the time it got published in 2018. So part of my work has been looking at that and all of that. So when Deepika mentioned to me that I'm supposed to moderate this a few days back, so I started running a pop quiz with anybody whom I met. Please name a digital company who you think is ethical and trustworthy. I'm still in that journey, so I'm not going to reveal my answers. But as an engaging audience in this group, I'm leaving this question to you. You don't have to answer it. They're all our members, so all the companies. So, but if after this session also I'm here, so I'll be very happy to take your feedback with what you find. So that's point number one. Second is, for any company, any organization, you go through these questions, right? At a starting stage, questions are about IP, where, how do you deal with it? How do you think about it? During fundraise, there are many ethical questions that you go and deal with. Then there is also product release. Then there are many ethical questions. And then there are generally ethical questions around transparency, how economical with truth we will be. So these are not new questions in the digital space. But I think what is interesting in the digital space is that, so let's, again, I won't name the companies, but in the aggregator business, the delivery partners we talked about and the other people who are the service providers, they are fighting for some of their rights, which they think are their rights. Investors, they are in a lot of visibility in terms of questions around ethics. Sometimes ethics also fit very nicely with the strategy in a digital environment. And in that sense, is it really about ethics, or it is just a narrative which is being built on very good strategy of business? So that's another thing that we have to think about. Another thing is that we are in a multi-jurisdictional compliance world. And then we also see examples where you are complying with something in a particular geography because there is a law in force, and it seems to make sense, but you're not doing this elsewhere because the law has not come into force or it is not there. So that kind of a question is also a question about ethics. And lastly, before we move on to the discussion, the flagship technology of today, artificial intelligence, presumably one can argue, is built on mass theft of data. So when you think of that and all of that, then this topic of, what is the standard of ethics and trust when we are in this digital world? Is it a philosophical question that we don't have those kind of promoters and founders? Or is it that the nature of business is such that if you invest in ethics and trust at that level, then probably you're going to miss that entire, growth that you're looking at. So I believe it's a bit complex, and I don't know what the answers are, but we'll definitely try to explore this. So Srinivas, I'll start with you. I mean, as IT BPM industry, one of the things that I have heard many people say is that we don't invest sufficiently in cybersecurity. No, that's a kind of a refrain, and being a processor industry. But again, speaking at an industry level, also tell us how you think about trust, and ethics, and because compliance is given, so we are not talking about that, and love to hear from you. I think only my mic works.
Yeah, I think before, thanks Ashish for having me here. Before I go into that, I think I want to spend a minute on what is the difference between regulation and ethics.
And before that also, tell us what you actually do.
Yeah.
We know you are a DPO, you do compliance, but what do you actually do?
Yeah. So if you look at regulations are always blacklisted. They're blacklisting. They talk about what you should not do. They will not tell what you should do. So anything that is not prohibited by law is permitted. So any company is free to innovate, embrace technology, new innovative use cases, as long as it is not blacklisted in the law. And that's where the ethics kicks in. It is for us to realize, companies to realize that even if it's not defined in the law, is it something we can do? And take example of insurance companies collecting data from hospitals. If you go to hospital and give data, there's a limitation. Your companies understanding your desperation through the web portals, your flag that you're going to fly tomorrow flight, and then they jack up the price. So all these technologies are giving them disproportionate ability for them to know your situation, current situation. Now all this was not existing when digital world was not there, and you cannot expect the laws to keep pace with all the So in one way to look at it is whatever makes economic sense is fine, but then that's not going to be ethical, because that's where, and these are reflections of society, and I think it's not possible to have one standard across the world. So therefore the debate is that can we say consistent ethics, and that brings to the narrative. So every company, even in the AI side, people call of ethical AI, it's simply a narrative today that I make my ethical principles, all of them comes from those 23 smaller principles. You have 7, 8, but those principles will tell about human in the loop, all that, right, blah, blah. And we conveniently write what we want to, and then we see that we meet, but there could be many use cases which we use, which can actually not be ethical, but then this general thing, I'm not talking about my specific industry. Coming to that, the point about your IT industry, because these IT industry case, we all companies in India are data processors, we are not controllers. So predominantly we don't get into the space of ethics and trust. However, so if we get in, then we become fiduciary, right? So we stay away from that. But on the data transfer case, there is a requirement for us to do all the due diligence to give them confidence. The SCCs are kind of paperwork. Although GDPR and many countries have made that, it is not enough to simply go by SCCs. Most customers won't agree. So you have to demonstrate the extra things of what you do. That's how some third-party audits happen. 27770, 27700, all that standards are there. I think it's important for us to go through that process of understanding the scenario and proactively informing customer about the risk scenarios that exist in the context of cybersecurity. For instance, whether the operations are going to have work from home, or is it inside the office, which is, let's say, air-gapped network. It has physical security controls. Does it have cameras? Now there again, you have to see how much surveillance you can do. So these aspects will determine the amount of investments you'll make into the cybersecurity. It is not one formula. That's how cybersecurity guidelines, even by the regulations, are not prescriptive. They leave at 10,000 feet and expect the customers to, the processors to do due diligence. Look at Article 32 of GDPR, and similar thing will be in India. You cannot expect law to tell what exactly you have to do. There, the trust and ethics comes into picture, because you will not get data transferred to India if you actually do not demonstrate the trust. So we do that through risk assessments, depending on exact scenario, and proactively we inform the customer and do the investment. That doesn't make us fiduciary. That's very clear in GDPR elsewhere also.
So if I just to
and sometimes to complete, this is also competitive advantage. So all of us try to do better than competitor to demonstrate, give confidence to client. Yeah, sorry.
No, that was my question. So what is it that a firm in IT industry does or tries to do differently? Because you said you're a processor.
Yeah.
So ethics and trust are more on the front line for the end user industry or B2C industry.
Right.
But
so that is when it comes to as a controller, fiduciary in the Indian context. I am referring to when it comes to data security, which is the main aspect when they transfer the data. We have much more than the SCC, the plain paperwork, because the SCC is not also completely prescriptive. There, each of our players, like all these companies like us, we have to demonstrate that we are the best, and we put the controls based on the perceived threats that we see in the current scenario. That is not common. The scenario is not one. For different kinds of industry, different kinds of data, is it work from home environment, is it ODC, as I said, air gap, non-air gap network, do you use Citrix? So all that stuff will come in picture, and these are not prescribed by law. So these are the aspects by
and
which
these things are lot standardized in the industry?
No, these are not standardized. So these are things which we, even standards don't prescribe. Even 27,000 will not, 27,002 doesn't prescribe this. The auditors can argue to say that, hey, you're not done enough, because they have experienced that 20 companies did it. But they don't become de facto standard until one day when like encryptions become de facto today. Yeah, like that.
Okay. All right. So one request I have is that if you can think of a couple of questions for us to discuss, and when you have them, just raise your hand. We'll not wait till the end. So we will pull them in as part of the conversation. So Abha, moving to you, now Air India was already big. Now it is even more big, right? So, and you have a bigger role then. So from an airline industry perspective, when I think of ethics, because again, moving beyond compliance, at least I think of, I see dark patterns, I see price collusion. Then there was this stuff like, this CrowdStrike, I see the CrowdStrike logo on the thing there, but it disrupted the industry, right? So when you are looking at it at the level of ethics and trust, what is really happening in the airline industry? I mean, what kind of stuff we are seeing, and also what do you do as part of your role, if you can just describe to us?
Thank you, Ashish. With respect to my role, I am still trying to figure out, because DPO has, the role of DPO. So there are many jurisdictions that have written DPO's role as this. Somebody says it is a mini regulator sitting inside. My role becomes all the more complex because balancing the role of DPO in so many countries and seen as somebody who's supposed to be safeguarding the rights of data subject, it becomes not only complex but very challenging, because an element which should be added to my job description is safeguarding rights of data subject, which is missing. Nonetheless, before I get into all those you've said about Ashish, about price collusion, practices, ethical standards and all, let me share with you that at Vistara, not very long ago, before we merged, we published a privacy notice to consumers in multiple jurisdictions. The reason why we did that is because we did not have all the phone numbers, all the email IDs, considering the manner in which we've been collecting data, where you go to a travel agent, one person books it, everybody gets booked in. So data minimization principle, I think that was built in by default. Having said that, we published a privacy notice in multiple jurisdictions, though there was no requirement in India. And this came as part of a very strong ethical practice. I'm proud to be part of that discussion, this organization and the group that empowers the practice. And this was very well received by the audience across, including other jurisdictions where this was done. Many of you who would have taken Air India flight would be receiving some communication where it says that, okay, we have received your data is being merged and things like that. So yes, the industry benchmark is being set and this is happening. Now, wherever we have, but what is the cost of doing it? So one of the panel that I had with Supratim, and we were discussing what is the cost of doing it. Now imagine you going to your management and telling them, you got to do it, but it is not backed by law. Srinivasa said, it's what is written in the law is what you can not, so it doesn't say what you can do. It'll say things are vague sometimes. Things are not as clear, and there is that gray area. You can do this, you cannot do this. It is not always possible for all those lawyers present here to say, you can do it because the law empowers you, and you cannot do it because the law does not empower you. There is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of interpretation that goes behind. Now, when you go as privacy leader to your boss and you tell them that, look, you got to do this because this is an ethical practice. Ashish, there isn't a lot of incentive for doing that today. And trust me, when we talk about businesses, as I mentioned, we are trying to prove that we are better than the others. At what cost? It's not always the monetary cost that counts. So the industry B2C is rising up. There are multiple customer surveys that have happened across jurisdictions where they say that I will give my data to somebody where I perceive that they are more ethical. Now, within the organizations, and the examples you pointed out, CrowdStrike and Delta Airline, and then there is a lawsuit, and now we are getting into the interpretation. Even GDPR will get into to understand whether laws, restriction on lawful access, authorized, unauthorized access, what is the breach reporting timeline, etc. Perhaps it will not come in this lawsuit because it is being contested in US, but nonetheless, should it be part of? Can it be? Because Delta Airline is facing a suit. Yeah. And a lot of communication has gone out in public domain where this thing continues to be debated. So on that parameter of ethic, my only thought process is, and being a strong advocate for the cause where we say, remember that there is a human at the end of the day. And there are harms. There's a reason why it is part of right to fundamental right. It is part of fundamental right. It is right to life. There's a reason to that. If you look at the harms, I think building ethics will go over, and I think trust will become part of it. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So at least we got a very real life example of demonstration, right? Our law as Supratim's students are becoming assistant professors. We are still waiting, but I think there are some good practices that we can definitely, look at. So, Sebastian, before I come to you, I'll pull in Deepak. So Deepak, you wear multiple hats. So I was thinking if I had to describe what you do, it will be quite complicated. But so you need to make an interesting pitch about that. But more than that, having been observing the industry, and I have followed your some of your writings in terms of the entire origination of some of this thinking. And so when you now look at the industry, what are some of the glaring gaps when you think of ethics, or trust, which we should be laying out on the table?
Thanks, Ashish, and nice to be back in DSCI and organization which I was also involved in sort of ideating in forming in the initial days about 15, 16 years back. So, sorry, I have a sort of sore throat, so just please bear with me. Yes, so currently I'm an external policy advisor to Palo Alto Networks, and also a senior consultant with another think tank called Center for Social and Economic Progress. Prior to this, I was the first public policy head of some startups, including SIFI, Microsoft, MasterCard, and Symantec. And have done some other work also. So for example, some of these, since 1997, I've been involved in, so anything in India, if you can use internet, if you can use Wi-Fi, VoIP, Bluetooth, good, bad or ugly, whatever the impacts, I've been some way part of that. Anyway, so coming to this question of ethics, I think in the digital realm, the issue of ethics first started about 15 years back when most of the people were concerned around e-waste. Prior to that, people were not really talking about ethics so much. And about a decade back, I got involved in this weird field called ethical AI, because under IEEE, they had established an IEEE Internet Initiative, which later on I was the global chair in 2018. But prior to that, in 2012-13, we started on work around ethical principles for AI and autonomous systems. In fact, there's an ethically aligned design, about 300-odd page document published in 2017, and a version 2 should be coming out soon. So most of the discussion in the recent past have come in the realm of ethics only with the onset of AI. Of course, prior to even generative AI, now of course it is much more accentuated. However, within the technology space, it is not such a new thing. So last year we had this movie, Oppenheimer, okay? And that movie also, of course, it was just a biopic, but nevertheless, it sort of revived the discussion which had happened decades back, that should there be a nuclear bomb? So the technology did exist. Should it be used in such a manner? And that was, again, I'll say, it was not just a political question, it was also an ethical question. And people took a certain decision based on whatever context and considerations that they had, but there was that issue. Now today when we look at ethics, and as I heard from some people earlier in the day that the tone should be set from the top. So I would say the chief executive officers should actually also consider themselves as chief ethics officer. Not just chief executive officer in terms of quarterly reportings, etc., but also as chief ethical officer and sort of uphold these things. Second thing is the ethics, and I'm not talking only for digital per se, but ethics should be actually predicated and should be sort of baked in within the value system of that organization. So if you don't even have those type of things stated, I'm not even saying practice, forget about seeing it in practice. But even if they are stated, ultimately they have to demonstrate it in practice. So for example, somebody might say that, okay, customer is the king and this and that, but do you actually have practices to demonstrate that? And that's where I think the rubber hits the road. And those are the scenarios where we do need to see where what you preach is what you practice. And just very quickly on...
So is it happening or it's not happening? What are you seeing?
I don't think it's happening in a big way. It's happening in small spurts here and there. And you were asking about this pop quiz, about digital company. I would broaden the scope. Name a company. That's it, okay? But when you come to ethics, the way I look at it is three basic questions. Number one, if there's something, can I do it? Do I have capability to do it? Second is, if I can, should I still do it? And third, if I can and if I should, what are the safeguards that I should take care of? Thank you.
Okay, so Deepak, when you broaden the question, I think we have many answers. But yeah, all right, thanks. Sebastian, we can see you. Earlier, we were only able to see half of your face, and I thought you were hiding. But good.
Can you see me? Can you see me?
All right, great. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Sebastian, I think it will be great to really understand very briefly what exactly is it that you do. And then, obviously, I want to really help the audience understand that when we think of this Euro Privacy Shield, what does it do in terms of trust, if not ethics, beyond compliance? Because everybody has to comply with the GDPR in Europe. So is it just that, or is it just branding, or what is it really? So yeah, love to hear from you.
Absolutely. So first of all, namaste to all. It's a great pleasure to join you. I would like to, maybe to introduce briefly. So I have the pleasure to chair the International Board of Experts, who is in charge of maintaining the European Data Protection Seal, Euro Privacy, which is under GDPR enables to certify data processing as compliant with the GDPR. It has many advantages. So to answer your question, Dr. Jan, maybe after I will make a connection with the ethical dimension, but let's start with the regulatory part. So as you mentioned it, everybody has to, at least in Europe, everybody has to comply with the GDPR, whether they like it or not. And if you are outside of Europe and you are processing data from data subject from Europe, you end up, in most cases, to be directly subject to GDPR or to have to comply with the GDPR because of your B2B partner who has shared data with you is subject to the GDPR. So at the end of the day, you have a regulatory obligation. So, but as you mentioned, if you comply with the law, why should you certify? So what we see now, so the certification is starting now in Europe because it took time for the European authorities to agree on the criteria, to agree on the accreditation procedures. We had, since a few months, the first seals being delivered, and we expect next year to have a flow of new certification at European level. But the first return of experience we hear, there are several reasons why people opt for certification or for using the criteria. The first, which is very interesting, we have some companies who decided to use the criteria, not for the certification, but just to document the compliance. That's the first steps. Because the main difference when you are using criteria which have been approved by the authorities as officially aligned with the requirement of the GDPR, it's far better than a standard which has been approved by SDOs, but which is not legally recognized by the authority. So it's a way already to reduce your risk. by using criteria which have been approved by 30 national authorities, which all recognize it legally as adequate criteria to assess compliance. That's a way to reduce the risk for you. That's the first element. So you can use it to document and reduce the risk by checking that you are complying with the different obligations. Then another element which is very interesting, that we see a paradigm shift. So when a company starts certifying its compliance, a major difference compared to other mechanisms is the fact that you turn your compliance into an asset. So it means that it becomes something you can value. In particular for the DPO, usually the DPOs are invisible to the board until there is a problem. When there is an issue, then everybody looks at the DPO. But all the good work which is done for compliance is invisible. So already you can value internally the work which has been done. When you have a third party coming to assess it, it's a way to demonstrate that, yes, we have done the work we had to deliver, rather than being in the uncertainty and waiting for a problem to emerge. But it's also a way to value the compliance towards third parties, towards, of course, the clients, the customers, if you want, to demonstrate that you are willing to comply, you're really dedicated to respect the personal data. So in particular, for B2C, I'm thinking Air India, this is typically the kind of industry where sometimes you want to demonstrate your compliance to your market. It can become a competitive advantage. It can be also a way also to simplify the compliance. I think there is a very good point which was raised regarding the fact that when you're a large company, you need to comply with different regulations. So it's sometimes very difficult to have a homogeneous approach. And using standards which have been approved by different countries, and I can say a few words after maybe about inter-privacy, which is another scheme which is in the process of being adopted, which is global, which is geographically neutral. The idea is precisely to simplify the management of compliance. So to have single set of criteria you can use in any country to demonstrate compliance with different regulations. It's also, in some cases, a mere requirement. We see that now it's emerging in Europe. It's at the very beginning, but for instance, in Germany, for the health sector, there are now, by law, an obligation to be certified in order to deliver some services. We have the same principle in Switzerland, for instance. So we see that it will become, at least for some markets, mandatory. The same way as by law, but sometimes by practice, once there will be a critical number of companies certified. We take the example of ISO 27001. At the very beginning, it was a voluntary, really a voluntary certification. It's still, in theory, a voluntary certification, but we know that for some industries, if you don't certify under ISO 27001, you have no access to the market. You're excluded of the market by different. So there's different element, but I would say, clearly, one element that we see emerging, which is very interesting, is this paradigm shift from addressing risk and compliance to creating value, to valuing the compliance. And certification is a very important tool. That's also very important in the context of, typically in the GDPR, Article 28 of the GDPR, when you are sharing data with another entity, you are liable for any wrongdoing of the other entity. So it means that data controller, maybe, or let's say Air India Germany decides to share data with a support service in India. Air India Germany is has excellent process, is really taking care of the data and so on. And the company in India has a problem, a data breach. It happens. But then the authorities will say, oh, you in Air India in Germany, you are responsible for what happened there. You should have been more careful before sharing the data. And certification is one of the only ways to reverse this process, to demonstrate if, as Air India, to say they're using a service which is certified, to say, no, they are certified. So then it will be to the judge to reverse the burden of the proof, to demonstrate, no, that was really a mistake of Air India. Otherwise, you have to prove that you have done everything you could to prevent any data breach by your data processor, meaning due diligence, controlling, and so on. So it's really a paradigm shift, which is very interesting. And if I may now, I'd like to come back to the question of ethics, which I find very interesting, if I may, very briefly. I think one thing which is very interesting with ethics is that usually many regulations emerged after being approved or agreed as ethical principles. We could say that before the GDPR, before data protection regulations, people had the feeling that personal data, you cannot do whatever you want with personal data. So in a certain sense, ethics is often the avant-garde, the pioneering model of defining some principles that sometimes over time becomes law. I would say before the adoption of DPDP in India, you had quite a number of companies which naturally would say, no, we need to take care of the personal data, regardless of any regulations. But being aware of these principles, being aware that there are some responsibilities when you are handling data of others, is a way to pave the way towards compliance. And I would say most probably, if you have a large company, and if you want to comply with the GDPR, you have two ways. One is to educate everyone about the different obligations and to explain data minimization, right of access, and so on, which is very good, and you have to do it. But a very efficient way is to explain the principles, what is behind it. And if you explain the principle, it's far more simple. It's simpler because the principle is fundamentally you have to protect the personal data because it belongs not to you as a company, but to the persons. And if you communicate these principles, which are more on the side of the ethics than on the side of the regulations, it's a very efficient way to align companies' behavior around principles which are, at the end of the day, monitored and regulated by the law.
Yeah, no, great point, Sebastian. I think you made a great case for, a way of how do you demonstrate trust, and then the last part about linking in terms of the chronology of, ethics and then translating them into the law. So Vikas, this is an interesting thing from an Indian context, given the heterogeneity of our users and businesses. If there is and we have the idea of impact assessment for at least the bigger guys or the more critical guys, but having, and DSCI, this is your event, our event. So
If I may,
DSCI could be doing.
Ashish, just to give, maybe if I may, Ashish, just to give a very interesting example. I'm sorry if I'm saying things which are not accurate. I'm not Indian, but if I understood correctly, in the Veda, in the Indian tradition, you have the golden rule, the principle, don't do to others that you wouldn't like others to do to you. And indeed, these principles, you will realize that many rules, regulations, are just a translation of these principles to specific cases. So I think, again, moving back to the principles, ethical principles, can be a good way even to anticipate future regulation.
All right, Sebastian. So, yeah, I think there is a scope for privacy shields and stuff like that to really translate some of this compliances into asset, as Sebastian said, and to then also demonstrate trust. So now I think we are in the final round of our conversation, which I want to focus on what are the real ways of operationalizing this idea of ethics and trust, right? It can't be left to only crisis and we use the crisis to live up to the occasion and deliver. And it can't be left to the founder or the leader of the organization only. That's too much of a portfolio risk in some sense. So as NASSCOM, I think we have recently curated a playbook on responsible AI. It's fairly comprehensive. I thought it was probably first in the world, and now increasingly I'm finding it is, as an industry-led effort, I would still say probably because I can't know for sure, but it's probably the first in that sense. So it looks at discriminative AI, it looks at generative AI, and it looks like at the application layer, and it has curated 4 stages of starting from conception, then to data collection, and then to design, and then to deployment and testing. And in all of this, it has created libraries of practices and steps that can be taken to really operationalize, trust. So I think that's one example, at least at an industry level, that we have been part of and that we are talking about. And another thing I think that we have recently discussed is that in a cross-border context, how do we operationalize this idea of trust? So global CBPR is something, Sebastian mentioned about the fact that different countries have different laws, but then there are principles which run through all of them. So is it possible to think of a legally backed mechanism which industry can adopt, which can take this further to say that, we can convey trust? So Srinivas, I know you have been part of some of this conversation. So do you want to talk about operationalizing trust and ethics and maybe talk about CBPR?
So I think it's important to transform the culture in the organization. Things which are not prescribed in the law can be achieved by emulating standards, models, frameworks, which are kind of best in class practices. Example could be like 27701, Euro privacy, CBPR, in the cross-border context CBPR, which will be used to transform the processes like privacy by design, right? Building those things proactively. But as we speak, I think Sebastian was mentioning, I agree with him, the last point. Take example of introducing, when the regime was opt-out, we were doing opt-in, let's say. We were proactively doing opt-in because we felt that's more satisfying to consumers. After some time that became law. Kinnell was the first about 7 years ago which said that you have to interpret it, and because e-privacy regulation was delayed, only e-privacy directive was there in Europe. So they said opt-in is mandatory because a lot of people were misusing consent to say that, So those are examples which show that practices which are ethical will become regulation soon. So you have to invent new ethical practices. So people who think of ethical practices have to compete. So that's a good thing because we compete with each other, we do better in the end, consumers benefit.
And also
our cost goes up for some time, but long term will recover.
And if you adopt early, maybe it can give you some advantage.
Yes, customer differentiation. So I think that's the way we go for in the cross-border context. CBPR is a huge advantage I see. We had a workshop recently, Sebastian also there. I think if we adopt that kind of framework, it not only gives framework for best practices, it is also acknowledged by various countries with whom we can do business. Because today the trust factor is very important when we transfer data. The regulations, you cannot come with one regulation across the world. Each country has their regulation. That will remain because data protection regulations are a reflection of country's own culture, values, which differ from each country. I think we can never assume that one regulation will happen. It is things like CBPR, instruments like CBPR, which will help bridge that gap. And they could be then adopted, except that as we discussed, we could reduce the burden in certain administrative procedures, like suppose we could say that the audit clause in CBPR can be merged with the audit clause in DPDP, then it reduces the burden.
Absolutely.
Those are things which we should look forward to if at all we adopt CBPR in India.
Yeah, so I think the nudges we are looking at is to say that it is government recognized and backed, and
Yes.
also then at a business level or even from a, let's say, government procurement, to say that I will prefer, like we discussed earlier, I think that if somebody is complying with certain ethical principles, similarly if somebody is CBPR certified, then that becomes a way of looking at a preference in terms of, partnerships.
Absolutely.
So, Abba, how do you think of operationalizing, at a scale, things like trust and ethics and thoughts?
Yeah. So vacuum cleaner has to run how it can navigate through your home. One fine morning, pictures of somebody's homes, somebody cleaning, somebody in washroom, somebody in the kitchen, apologies for that, end up on the internet in a third jurisdiction. Now, can somebody answer, will a fine save it? Will a fine help it? And it can be mine in your home as well, right? Another incident, we put an algorithmic tool to identify early warning systems. Let's see how many people are doing fraud for some of the benefits that are given by the government. And based on that, a certain group, a certain ethnicity, a certain income group, age group, etc. got discriminated. They were deprived of their rights. And 10 years later, you discover, oh, there was a problem in the tool. Can somebody tell me, will fine help addressing these situations? Things like, you have those CVs, HR, right to life, right to livelihood, we love that. But those are HR applications where remove the name, redacted, but it was written women football team or women volleyball team, out. Applications where it said tutors after a certain age group, no, you cannot. Now look at the propensity of these losses. I'm not saying this is going to happen all the time. Breaches, mishandling of data. It is easy, right? In that Excel sheet, share it to everybody, mark 10 more people in CC so that they know that, a lot of hard work is happening on this department. One misspelled name and the harm that it can arise. Healthcare. You just handed over your password to somebody. We all have been taught, change your passwords. I would urge you to read up this event that happened, which is Colonial Pipeline Matter. 2021, 5,500 mile pipeline comes to a standstill, no gas, because somebody's password was compromised in a third-party breach, 75 bitcoins paid, which is close to a couple of dollars. So this is the kind of examples. And the last one, a breach that happened at the headquarters of a certain organization, and then there's a statement which comes from one of the human rights activists who says, do you know that there are people who are writing over this platform under pseudonym, and the fact that their names have been exposed, probably the world will never hear from them ever again. So I would say, as privacy champions, when we have to operationalize, not at the cost of instilling fear, but helping people understand that this is not just about fines, penalties, processes, violations, etc. This is a lot more than that. And when we begin the conversation asking people, do you know what is happening with your data? You're also a data subject somewhere. I think that brings a lot of, and I've seen in the last couple of years that I've been in the space, that brings a lot of accountability. And I believe that has helped me. So if it helps somebody else, thank you.
Oh, absolutely. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to, between Deepak and Sebastian, feel free to come in and really in terms of anything that you wish to add now, because we are at the winding stage of this conversation, in terms of operationalizing trust and ethics. Are there some things, for example, we talk about these voluntary commitments. Now, again, any thoughts on these things? Are these good mechanisms, or they are frowned upon at times to say that okay, fine, it's kind of something that you are saying, but how do you actually then demonstrate that you have lived up to those voluntary commitments? Are you seeing some of that which gives you confidence that this is something worthwhile? Any comments or anything else that you want to add?
I would say clearly we see different elements which are clear. Again, we cannot predict the future, but we see clear evolution, clear trends. So first of all, the need to have criteria which are more universal possible, but with a high level. So what we see fundamentally, so we are supporting a lot the dialogue between France and Global CBPR Forum, the European authorities and so on, trying to support interoperability. And we see that one of the main concerns is to reach to the same level. So to avoid having different levels. And that's something where we are quite confident that, as you know about inter-privacy, which is now under review by IEF, we expect early next year, Q1, to have it endorsed by IEF for accreditation worldwide, could be already a breach among these different regulations to have a common standard with global CBPR, EU GDPR, Convention 108+, of the Council of Europe, to have a common platform that you can ensure an adequate level of compliance in any jurisdictions. We see also with the multiplication of data regulations, in particular in Europe, there is a lot going on, and the need for companies to not only to try to comply, but to build confidence that they have the feeling that, yes, they are complying. Not only they try to comply, but to have at the moment an external validation. And that's where certification, I think, plays a very important role, because you get this third-party validation. It's not me stating that, I'm doing a lot to comply. It's somebody else coming to check that I'm effectively complying.
Right, Sebastian,
that's very important.
yes, I think you made a very strong point, and we take that.
Yep.
I'm going to come to Deepak if he has something to add, and I think we want to leave few minutes for the audience if they have anything to say.
No problem.
Deepak, any last word from your side?
2 points. One, Ashish, in the playbook of NASSCOM, I would suggest add one more stage, 5th stage, which is about the demise, okay, or retirement of that particular whatever you have deployed. So you did mention the last stage was I think, deployment and testing, right? But I would
Monitoring.
say go beyond that, even to demise. So what happens when, let's say, you sort of retire that system or something like that? So oftentimes people forget that stage because jab tak kuch chal raha hai, theek hai. And now why do we need to even bother about it? So that's one suggestion. Anyway, coming back to the voluntary commitments when you say, and I think this is a little dichotomous phrase itself. It's voluntary and commitment. Okay, so but I think within that space, what we need to look at is, and here I would just like to talk a little bit about the role of the governments also in this. What happens is, typically, and this is not only in India, most of the countries, if we see around the world, the governments are acting when it comes to data collection. And I'm not talking of data collection only of individuals, but I'm talking of data collection within the realm of, let's say, cybersecurity, data breaches, etc., as sponges. That is fine. There's a breach, you report it to the government, and there may be regulations, whatever the norms, and it's fine, you report that. But I think what the governments need to rethink about is that they should act not just sponges, but as honeybees. So they should collect different things from different places, process it, and then share it in a manner which can still be used for all the stakeholders without exposing from where you had got what, from which flower, what nectar, how much you got, at what point of time, what. So none of that data points, none of that metadata, but actually the whole analysis, etc. And I think that's something which we need more timely and in more transparent and in a more productive manner as a matter of public-private partnership. So I would say, rather than talking only about public-private partnership, we should also talk about private-public partnership. Thank you.
All right, guys, any questions? Any comments? Dilip. Yeah, or you can take this.
Thank you. It was fantastic to listen to all the comments. I just wanted to share an incident that happened this week. A platform which I hadn't logged into sent me an email saying that you have not been on the platform for X number of days. And if you want us to retain your data, please write to us. Otherwise, we're going to delete the data, right? I thought that was fantastic. I know Vikasji has not rolled out the rules yet, but they reached out to an Indian citizen without the DPDPA rules in place. And to me, that was an example of ethics, right? I hope that becomes a norm. Hopefully, the rules will enable that. But this is something which was a clear example of what ethics mean in the context of privacy.
That's a great point to come in as a comment, right? So I think just to conclude, as NASSCOM and also when I look at the industry and I think DPOs and CISOs can do only so much. It is a much bigger agenda. So let's be mindful of that. But as NASSCOM and DSCI, what we would like to do over the next few years as we get more and more into the digital economy and look at both the adoption of AI and look at operationalization of our data protection law and more data usage is to showcase champions who are really on top of ethics and trust. Because it's very, when I talk to a lot of startups, it's like, if somebody else is not doing it, why should I? And this is a very dangerous game. And the danger in that is that sometimes the bad practice.
Vacuum cleaner has to run, how it can navigate through your home. One fine morning, pictures of somebody's homes, somebody cleaning, somebody in washroom, somebody in the kitchen, apologies for that, end up on the internet in a third jurisdiction. Now, can somebody answer, will a fine save it? Will a fine help it? And it can be mine in your home as well, right? Another incident, we put an algorithmic tool to identify early warning systems. Let's see how many people are doing fraud for some of the benefits that are given by the government. And based on that, a certain group, a certain ethnicity, a certain income group, age group, etc. got discriminated. They were deprived of their rights. And 10 years later, you discover, oh, there was a problem in the tool. Can somebody tell me, will fine help addressing these situations? Things like, you have those CVs, HR, right to life, right to livelihood, we love that. But those are HR applications where remove the name, redacted, but it was written women football team or women volleyball team, out.
you.